What's up, guys? This is Desm 101. Thanks for tuning in. Today, I wanted to take a look at the game Bug for the Sega Saturn, an early release for the system. While not quite a release title, Bug came out in the US only a few weeks after the surprise launch of the console in May of 1995. The game is credited to Real Time Associates and the Sega Away team. It uses pre-rendered 2D sprites made on Silicon Graphics desktop machines, the same way Donkey Kong Country's characters were. It features 2.5D gameplay in 3D levels, meaning your character can only move on one axis at a time, up and down or left and right. So there's no true 3D control in the game. For its time, it felt like a step in the right direction for platform games, similar to how Virtual Boy was attempting 3D enhanced games like Mario Clash. However, only a year later, Super Mario 64 would release and really define the 3D platformer genre from then on. With that in mind, we can see Bug as a proto 3D game that still bows to many of the rules of classic 2D games. The basic controls for Bug are similar to most platformers of the time. He can jump on enemies to kill them, he can duck, but there is no run button. The player can pick up various power-ups like a Spitwad projectile, Zap Attack, and Health Restore. There are also gems to acquire. They will give you a Dragonfly coin after 100 are picked up in a stage. If you get 3 Dragonfly coins for a specific area, you'll get to play a special bonus level where you ride the Dragonfly through rings. There are also large coins which can take you to a stage bonus level if you visit the Daddy-O Longlegs, who stands at specific locations, and he'll teleport you to the bonus stage, which usually involves collecting Oscar-like statues. Bug has typical one-liners and quips just like many other game mascots of the time. Thankfully, he only spouts these out when hit, collecting items, or taking out enemies. Still, it doesn't do much to set itself apart from so many similar characters on 16-bit consoles at the same time. So, the CGI models that the characters are based on are not very great and interesting designs, in my opinion. They're composed of simple shapes and have personality types reminiscent of 90s cartoon characters with the proper toot and general funkiness. Where games like Toe Jam and Earl handled this aesthetic well, it feels kind of tired already by 95, and when you compare the look of the designs to something like Donkey Kong Country, it just seems lacking. Add that to the fact that this is one of the first 32-bit games to show off the pre-rendered look on the Sega Saturn, and you have some slightly disappointing results. The stages are all quite colorful and detailed with multiple paths and objects like mushrooms that can spring you into the air to reach higher places. Each area has its own theme, such as a desert, underwater, snow, and more, all illustrated and detailed fairly well. The presentation leaves a good impression overall, but after a bit of time spent on the game, you might not find it as pleasant to look at as something like Sonic 3. But it is full of those scaling moments where you or your enemies are moving towards or away from the screen to give a nice 3D effect. Other than the subtle use of the 3D here, there really isn't that much that screams a 32-bit game or trying to show off what a 32-bit game could do. The story setup is really similar to something like Gex from the 3DO around the same time. It has this kind of TV movie filmmaking theme. In this scenario, Bug is a newly hired actor, and each area of the game is a different set from the film that he's working on. In the plot of the movie, his family has been kidnapped by Queen Kadabra, a spider which is seen in the opening animation. The story doesn't really factor into the game much at all. You can see the edge of the movie set after you beat a boss to indicate that Bug is moving to the next area. But overall, it doesn't really have any impact to the gameplay itself or really make any lasting impressions. Maybe comparing it back to Gex, where maybe it was a bit more cohesive with the theme of the films or the TV shows that he was involved in. The controls of the game make it feel really dated, in my opinion. since it's too limited to work as a 3D game. Even thinking in 2D terms, the controls feel stiff. Bug cannot run, which makes the game sluggish at times. It's great to find a weapon, but they are very limited, so instead you will be relying on carefully timed jumps to deal with most enemies. There's quite a bit of platforming too, and the game likes to place enemies in tricky spots near pitfalls, resulting in a lot of cheap deaths. Many edges on any particular path that Bug walks on has an invisible wall, so places where you think you should be able to jump up or down, or even over, are blocked off in a lot of cases. Even if you want to try and hurry up through a stage after you die, you need to take your time getting through each part. And this leads to the difficulty of the game, which ramps up quite quickly. Enemies end up rushing at you and attacking from off-screen, giving you little time to react. It definitely requires some level of memorization for enemy locations because there's almost no way to see them coming the first time you play. With enough practice and playtime, you get used to the locations and how to maneuver out of harm's way. There are stage checkpoints, represented by a flower, but they are few and far between, and the stages become large sprawling areas where you have to retread those same linear paths to get to where you need to go, although you might have the option of one or two. Each one of these paths proceeds in a linear fashion, so it's nothing like having the option to wander off in an open world. It's more like being stuck in corridors of specific paths. We're able to see the rest of the path, but not switch from one to the other easily, even though it looks like you should be able to. Then there's the camera, which is not controllable, and by default sits a bit too close to your character, making it very hard to see what is ahead or around you. The camera may back off sometimes when you go into the distance, allowing more of a viewing area, but for most part it's stuck. It also scrolls ahead in the direction you are facing, which can get really annoying because you may be looking for an enemy which is coming at you, but you might have to switch directions mid-air during a jump while you're trying to attack the enemy, and the screen will be scrolling left and right, back and forth, so you can't see who's coming up next easily. And then what will happen is you'll usually get hit. With all the factors of outdated 2D controls, the wonky camera, and drawn-out levels, it's easy to burn out on this game pretty quickly, especially nowadays. Now, back when I originally first played this, my experience with the Saturn was through a friend who had got it shortly after it was released. He was the only one that I knew that had it, and he lived nearby me. We went to high school together. He ended up letting me borrow the Saturn for a week because he didn't have much time to play it. Of course, I jumped on the opportunity and went to the video rental store as soon as I could. Bug was one of the first games I picked up and played on the Saturn, along with Virtua Fighter and Daytona USA. At that time, I was pretty hyped on the idea of 3D games and was really impressed with the presentation and gameplay at Bug when I started. I found it a bit frustrating since it was very easy to die and get stuck in the first couple levels, but eventually I made it to the first boss and didn't really play the game much after I lost at that point. I ended up returning it and not really thinking about it much except for some fond memories of associating it with the Saturn in my experience. In recent times, I ended up picking up a Sega Saturn and got this game fairly quickly because I remembered playing it early. And after playing it for about an hour when I had got this game, I became pretty annoyed, and I haven't really played it a lot in the Saturn. And not a bad game or a horrible game, just one that has really shown its age really well, and that doesn't play great in the context of some other games on the Saturn today. So if we look at how Bug was received when it came out, it always kind of had a history of mixed reviews, although it was generally positive. It also sold quite well, and by the end of 1995 it was the second best-selling Sega Saturn title behind Daytona USA. People think of the game fondly because it was an early release. There was also some critics who gave it less than favorable reviews. It was never panned. GameSpot gave it a 6 out of 10, GamePro gave it a 4.5 out of 5, just as an example. Bug is a critical part of the perception many Western gamers have for the Saturn, a machine that had great potential, but was ultimately undone by being released too early and competing with too many other Sega consoles on the market. Couple that with PlayStation's lower price point and better 3D game presentation, and it becomes clear why people think of the Saturn as a bad or failed console here in the States, which is really unfair to the 2D powerhouse that the Saturn still lives on as to this day. Perhaps if some of these early titles on the Saturn didn't feel so rushed, we may have seen a better impression of the console begin to form. As it serves now, however, the early releases like Bug only helped to show the Saturn was a step or two behind the burgeoning trends in gaming at the time. Bug was successful enough to warrant a sequel, which didn't really make any waves. It made minor improvements to the gameplay, added more playable characters, but is otherwise just more of the same. Thus, Bug ended up fading into obscurity. Sega drafted up a contract that was signed during the development, which secured them the rights to Bug from Real-Time Associates. So if there ever was a return of the character, Sega would have to greenlight it themselves, or someone would have to sell the rights back, or buy them from Sega. So, overall, Bug is an early good game to pick up for the Saturn for collectors. Perhaps more for the historical curiosity than playing for any lengthy amount of time, although I'm sure not everyone will agree with that statement. Some may find plenty of charm and a lot of engaging gameplay. Most gamers now will likely quit shortly due to the frustrating mechanics that ultimately hinder the experience. So, for fans of the Saturn, I would recommend to check it out, give it a try. Otherwise, maybe pass unless you really are an avid collector.